So we're rounding down to the last piece. But this was, a necessary voice to hear the people who were there. Next, we're going to hear what we're doing currently to proceed toward a memorial. And what we're doing is scientific research, and it's incredibly cutting edge, valuable, and it's breaking through barriers of knowledge that I think will change the world and change the way we understand history. So we are lucky enough to have Dr. Philip Reeder. He is a professor of the Center for Environmental Research and Education within the School of Science and Engineering at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was previously Dean of UCane's Bayer School of Natural and Environmental Sciences. He has a PhD in geography from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. He has completed research and published numerous book chapters and articles relating to the geoarchaeology of the ancient Maya in Belize, and using geoscience to interpret biblical sites in Israel, and using science to write and rewrite the history of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. So we welcome Philip Reeder and what he has been doing for the last year.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. As a scientist, I'm going to try to not speak as scientifically as I normally would at a professional conference. I'm really just going to tell you a story about what we do and what we've done at various places throughout Latvia and in Lithuania and in Poland as well. Today, we will focus on Jungfernhof. So, as Karen said, I'm a professor now at the Center for Environmental Research and Education at Duquesne University, which is in Pittsburgh. And the title, Using Science to Uncover the History of the Jungfernhof Concentration Camp, those two things really go hand in hand. And a lot of what we talk about when we're working at these sites is that we're looking for the hidden history. The fact that there is things in history books, but there's lots of information that still needs to go into history books. And how can we use science to uncover that information? So we've heard about the history of the camp, and it has a long history dating way back before when it was actually Jungfernhof, when it was a manor. And there's an etching down there in the bottom from 1798 of the manor house and some of the accompanying buildings. And of course, what we're focused on is this period of World War II, occupation by the Nazis. 1941, 1942 was an extraordinarily harsh winter. Jews were being held at this concentration camp in old barns and stables that were not weatherized at all. The conditions were extremely harsh, and many died over that winter. Up to 800 people died at the camp over that winter. From what the testimonies say, from what's in the history books, it was a cold, harsh winter. The bodies were essentially piled up until spring, and then eventually a mass grave was dug, but it was impossible to dig because the ground was still frozen even in the spring. So they used dynamite to blow a hole in the ground and then to put these bodies. And the big question is, where? We talk about memorialization, we talk about memorializing the site. As scientists, we want to use science to find that spot so that people can go to Jungfernhof and say, I'm at Jungfernhof, it's a park now, and somewhere my ancestors, my relatives are buried here in a mass grave. We want to say the mass grave is here. So we've been working for the last 4 years to try and find the mass grave. So as scientists, we pose all kinds of questions that we're trying to answer, or we propose hypotheses that we're trying to prove and disprove. I won't go through all this. But what we do is we use instrumentation, we use technology, ground penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography. We use old air photographs. The Nazis were actually good photographers from the air, and they left behind a legacy of some outstanding air photographs of places. And we try to pull all that information together using the science, using the history, using what we might find in archives, what we have from testimony, to then tell the most accurate story of this place. Bones. When someone is murdered, when someone dies, their bones remain behind. And we've talked about the fact that following Jewish law, Jewish tradition, the graves are not supposed to be disturbed. We received special permission from the rabbi of Riga to not dig up anything, because we do no excavation, but to collect soil samples using a device that probes down in the ground and takes a very, very, very small sample to test and see what we can find from Jungfernhof. Are we going to find the old building materials? Are we going to find remnants of the camp? Are we going to find human bones at the site? So we're not in any way defiling these graves. We have the permission of the rabbi to be able to do this. Under the context of the story of these people needs to be told. And there's a lot in the history books already of what happened there. But again, where are these people? Where can the ancestors go to see the place where they are interred and where they're buried? So that's one of the big efforts that we're trying to undertake. So we use technology to be able to do that. We use some technology that involves instrumentation that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what we do is we go to the site, we lay out up here, we lay out these grids, and along those grids, we collect ground penetrating radar data. And I'll tell you just a little bit about ground penetrating radar and what it does. This is the act of collecting that data. It allows you to look beneath the surface, to figure out some of the characteristics that are beneath the surface, to figure out if they are natural or if they are anthropogenic, meaning human altered. In the case of looking for a mass grave, there are certain telltale signs that you would look for. We also, as I said, took samples of the soil. I'm proud to say that's my youngest son there, taking samples. One of the things that we do is we always take students with us from our various universities and introduce them not only to the technology, but why we're doing what we're doing. Many have no context whatsoever for the Holocaust and what happened in the Holocaust. So to bring that to them and to bring an understanding to them of what happened. And this is just a small sampling there in the lower right of some of the places that we looked. So looking at this particular, actually it skipped. Sorry, it skipped ahead on me. Okay, looking in the lower right-hand corner here, so this is the site of where the camp was. The Dungava River is right over here. These are the remains of ruins of two buildings that existed from that era of the Jungfernhof camp. These are places where we collected ground penetrating radar data. So just a tiny bit about the technology. So this is ground penetrating radar, that is the unit. These are two students from the United States collecting this data. And essentially what it does is it shoots FM radio waves down into the ground, and that is a transmitter for those waves. And then the materials that are beneath the surface will reflect those waves back up towards the surface, and there is a receiver that then collects them, and then it goes into, we'll call it the black box of software and technology, which then figures out what it's looking at in the subsurface by producing a plot of that information that, if you're expert enough to review that plot, you can tell many of the characteristics of the subsurface. If you're not, it looks like a bunch of lines in different colors and it's really impossible to interpret. But we work with geophysicists. I'm not a geophysicist, I'm a geographer, and they have the ability to interpret what they're seeing in the subsurface. This is electrical resistivity tomography. There's a line laid on the ground right there. And electric current is emitted into the ground. The ground then interacts with that electric current, and depending on what the subsurface characteristics are like, it will then reflect an image back up to the surface. That electrical current will be collected and then run through software, and the software will give you an image of what's in the subsurface. And again, you have to be somewhat expert to be able to interpret this. I will show you some of the plots, and I will just show you some of the little highlights that are on the plots of the data that tells us really important information about what's going on in the subsurface. So I am the mapper for the research team. I have a PhD in geography. I love maps. I've loved maps my whole life. Been working on projects in the Baltics since 2015, and my part of the project is to organize all the mapping, to create all the maps, because many of you will never get to go visit these places. Many of you will not be there while we're collecting the data, but then the maps and the diagrams, the graphs and everything else that we produce and that we publish, put into reports, is our way of telling what's going on there and what we found and what we've done. So we also use aerial imagery, and some places we work, we diligently look through archives, work for archivists, and they just say, there's nothing. We cannot find any old images of this place. Well, luckily at Jungfernhof, there is some imagery. This is a 1917 air photograph of the Jungfernhof site. So we have an idea then of what buildings were there in 1917, how the buildings were organized. This is then that 1917 information blown up with all the buildings highlighted that were there in 1917. You can see this one building's highlighted a little different, and I'll talk about that. That was one of our first big discoveries the first year that we went there and actually collected a lot of data, which was in 2021. This is then the information from 1917 put onto a 2022 satellite image so that we can see then where all the 1917 buildings were and the arrangements of buildings at Jungfernhof associated with the modern landscape, the park that's there. This is the park area right here. So none of these buildings exist anymore except for this one has been rebuilt slightly. It's ruined, and this one has been rebuilt slightly, and this one has been rebuilt slightly. This is a vacation home area that's actually built now over part of what used to be the camp. And then sometimes you just have these amazing discoveries that just sort of come out of nowhere. We're working with a technician at the University of Wisconsin who works with my colleague, Dr. Harry Joel, who is in charge of the ground penetrating radar part of the project. And he was communicating with an archivist in Riga, in Latvia, and he said, is there a 1944 air photo? Because the Nazi Luftwaffe did a lot of flights over Riga and over Latvia where they took air imagery. And he said, we looked on your site, we found nothing. And he went and he came back a few weeks later and he said, you know what, we have an image, but it was not turned on, so you couldn't see it on the site. So we found a 1944 air photograph just recently, within the last month. This is it. So this is what Jungfernhof looked like in 1944. It's rather a rough image right now. These are made from glass plates that the Luftwaffe utilized to then as the master photograph that then copies could be made. This copy that was made unfortunately got water damaged somewhere. All of this here is water damage, and a lot of the spots over here are water damage. These are all bomb craters actually out here. So we're working with that archive to try and find a more original photo made from those plates so that we can see precisely what was there in 1944, thinking that it's going to be the same thing that was there in 1941 and 1942 as well. There's maps and map collections as well. There's a 1942 map. There's a 1947 map. So we do lots of overlays of different maps to try to figure out when things were there, when things weren't there, between what period of time was something built there. One of the things that we established was you can look at the 1942 map and look at how few buildings are depicted in 1942 at the site versus 1947 versus 1917. And we have determined that the 1942 is just not accurate. Whoever updated the map in 1942, it's the middle of the war, all kinds of things were going on, and they did not do a good job of updating the map. So we threw this one out as not being the reality of what the camp looked like. And I could spend an hour explaining this right here. What that diagram does is it explains what was there in 1917, what was there in 1942. Again, we discarded that, what was there in 1947, and when the building phases are for what building existed when at Jungfernhof. There's other technologies that we used as well. There's a technology that's called LiDAR, which is a type of radar. It uses a laser beam, essentially, that is shot out of a unit at thousands of times a second, and it creates a super accurate map of that place, to the point that you could be standing on the landscape. One of the things we'd be looking for if there's a mass grave with 800 people in it is some kind of a depression that would stay behind, probably in that 80 years since that grave was put in place. You can't see it with the naked eye, but the instrumentation would see it. So that's what these plots are. So just to explain a little, that's old buildings that were formerly at the site. These are some of the places where we collected data. That's an electroresistivity ERT line there. We collected data along that. We collected data along that. These blue areas here are GPR, ground penetrating radar grids, where we've collected information as well. And then this is what comes from that, it's called GeoSlam. It's the instrument that collects this super sophisticated, detailed topographic data at the area, looking for micro-topographic features that might be remnants from when the Jungfernhof camp was there. I say all that, unfortunately, we couldn't find anything using that technology. So some of the technology is very successful, sometimes the technology is not successful. So some specifics of some of the things that we found so far. So I've showed the air photos, showed it superimposed on a satellite image. We have a basic idea of where some of the structures were located at the site. So this particular grid right here, GPR Grid 2, we did that in 2023, so just last summer. And what we were looking for, testing our technology, and to see what kind of signal we would get and what kind of image we would get if we imaged over top of where some of the former buildings were at the site. So this building right here is this image, and this is the ground penetrating radar image. The dotted line I added to enhance it so that you can see it, because again, to the untrained eye, it looks like a bunch of splotches and blobs and lines and such, but you can see that they're organized. They go this way, and then that way, and then that way. Nature will not build things that have sharp right angles like that. Under extraordinary circumstances, it might, but you don't find that in nature. So it means that it's anthropogenic. It's some kind of a human-created feature. I'm going to talk about something that's circular in a minute. Same thing. Nature, there's processes that will create things that are circular naturally in nature, but most likely, if you find something that is perfectly circular, it's going to be some kind of a human-created anthropogenic feature as well. So along with then the collection of the ground-penetrating radar data, there was the augering into the soil, and that's using the device to go down into the soil to collect samples from the soil to see what the soil is like, because it's important to quantify that, because it affects how the instrumentation works by knowing what the soil is like, but then also to collect anything that is anthropogenic, human related to it, construction materials, bones, and here's just a few of the materials that were collected from here. So an old bent nail and a piece of glass, most likely from the building that stood there at one time. And then this is the electrical resistivity tomography. And again, I'm not going to get too technical on it. This is ERT profile line 1, so that's that line right there. And this is 2, and that's that line right there. And then you can see there's 4 places that are highlighted on it. Okay, you see in this top one, you see kind of this pink layer, and then it stops. And then the pink layer, and it stops. And then the pink layer again. Well, that pink layer, the earth and the processes that are going on will naturally create layers of material. We're right next to a river, so there's all kinds of flooding that has happened in the past. And if you find those layers cut off and truncated, it means that something's happened there and that something most likely has been dug there, because there's no kind of natural process that's going to do that. So this particular location and this right here, number 2 and number 1, corresponds with this and this. So if we go ahead, this right here is the remains of that building from Jungfernhof that used to be there. On the land surface, there's no indication that it's there, but it's there. Either the foundation of it or just the disturbance in the soil from creating this building is there. Same, this is a little bit different mode that the electrical resistivity ERT does. You turn it on, you shoot electricity into the ground. When you turn it off, anything that's metal will, here's the technical term, ring. It will ring because it's been charged with electricity, and the instrument, even though it's turned off, will pick it up. Tell you that it's there, and there's buried metal objects beneath the surface. So another piece of evidence then that the natural layers of sediment are cut off, and there's something buried in the ground at that particular location. This we discovered in 2021, and then again, that's when this line was completed, and that is this feature right here. When we first discovered it, we were a little excited, and we said, we may have found where the mass grave is. And this is like miraculous because we've only been working here like 2 days, and we may have found where it was. That's before we had all the images laid on top of each other to see where the buildings were. Eventually, we discovered that it was a building, and it's the remains of a building at that location. If you look at the bottom down here, this is the ground penetrating radar plot, and then this is the electrical resistivity plot, and you can see it's been enhanced right there with this dotted line. That's equal to that right there, and this, hard to see, but that's pulled out of the 1917 air photo, and there was a building at that place. In fact, the ground penetrating radar even picks up the doorway. There's the doorway into the building right there. So that's a wall, doorway, wall, doorway. And then there it is, highlighted then from the 1917 air photo, but then put onto a 2022 satellite image right there. And that turns out that that building is halfway into the private garden plot summer housing area, and then halfway into what is now the park, which is right there. So here it is, just depicted in a different way. There's the doorway into the building, there's the walls of the building. But then in 2022, kind of working more out towards the center of the area of the park, we discovered this feature. And it's this circular feature right here. And this circular feature is about 10 meters across, so about 30 feet long. And again, nature's not going to build naturally through natural processes circular features like this. So then this warranted much more examination, this particular part of the camp where we discovered this particular feature. I'll get back to that. I just want to show you some of the other things that we found and discovered. Working over in this area, this is the old manor house right here, and that was ruined, but it's been partially rebuilt now. And then working in this part of the camp, this is the ground penetrating radar plot. This is what's called a data slice. You're looking from above. And what the software allows you to do is peel the ground away and keep looking deeper and deeper and deeper. So we're looking here about a meter beneath the surface, and we're seeing the walls of something. And then these are the walls that have been enhanced by putting these lines on. And then this is looking from the side at the data. And you say, well, it looks like a bunch of squiggly lines. Well, a geophysicist who's expert in electrical resistivity can look at it and make interpretations that this area is disturbed, this area is disturbed, and this area is disturbed in the subsurface. Even though it's a meter beneath the surface, you can't see any resemblance of that on the surface. It's still happening. So one of the things that we have to do is, here's the 1944 air photo, and to get the better version of the 1944 air photo so that we can start to correlate some of these features to what was there in 1944. Because even though this photo is damaged, in the area of this, you can still see that there's something there. It looks like a barnyard with a chicken coop or something like that. But we don't have a good enough photograph to make really solid interpretations of that. So here's the zoom in on that then. This is the 1944 air photo. This is the new barracks that was constructed late after the 800 people in the mass grave were buried. This was in 1943, and that's actually a new building there in 1943. This is the area right there where that previous structure was located, and there's something there. But again, it's not clear enough in this damaged photograph to be able to see exactly what was there. And then last thing then, in 2023, with the permission of the rabbi, we got permission to be able to do this soil probing into the ground and to try to understand the soils in the context of how well our equipment would function there and some of the interpretations we would make from the data, but then also to see what came up as we collected these various samples of soil. So this, again, is electrical resistivity line number one. Number two, this is a ground penetrating radar grid. And you might think, well, how long does it collect this data? An hour, 2 hours? No, it took 3 days to collect the data from this grid right here. And then this is where that circular anomaly appeared. So that was of great interest to us. So then we did a detailed program of probing the soil to try and see what kind of features came up and what kind of things came up associated with probing the soil. So here are the students collecting the data. That's one of my students there, and then that's my son, and collecting samples every 10 centimeters, laying them out, trying to understand the soil in terms of its characteristics, but then here they are picking through the soil, trying to find anything that might be human-related in the soil. So we learned a number of different valuable things, one of which was these are all flood deposits, most likely post-dating World War II, from several large floods that were there. But then there's this interesting layer right here of clay. It's about 20 centimeters thick. And then below it, it's all sand. This is stuff that washed out of the glaciers 10,000 years ago at this place. This is some kind of a flood deposit, but it's enriched with clay. And then this is all silt-sized material, and these are more recent floods in the area. And you might think, well, why is that important? Well, that clay layer actually becomes very, very important. So here's the material that was collected. This is near the surface, that's the silt. This is the clay-rich material. You can see it has different characteristics. And then this is the sand material below it. Well, here it is, kind of a schematic of what the landscape in terms of the soil and its nature beneath the surface. So these are the silt flood deposits. This is the clay layer. This is the glacial outwash. So one of the things we did is we had the students do probing down to a depth of about 1 meter to see where the clay layer was and where the clay layer wasn't, because if you're going to dig a mass grave, the clay layer is going to be destroyed. So the radar is one tool then for trying to find where these features might be in the subsurface. But again, that's a really long, time-consuming process to be able to collect that data. It takes days and days to get enough data to be able to start to make interpretations. The electrical resistivity tomography, same thing. Those lines I was showing you, they were collected over probably a 8 to 10 hour period it would take to collect that kind of data. To have the students go around with the probe and go down 1 meter, they can do a very large area in a day to see if the clay layer is there, the clay layer is not there, and then in places where it's not there, then we could bring the radar there to get a better picture of what's going on in the subsurface. So here's some of the materials that we pulled out. They were collected, again, with the permission. We had all the permits to be able to do this. We had the permission of the rabbi to be able to do this. They were brought back to the United States. And then I had a bioanthropologist at my university look at the bones and do an initial assessment of them, thinking, are they human, are they animal? That was our first step. And they all turned out to be animal bones so far, which makes sense because, as you saw in the video, it was a sheep and a cattle farm. So there's bones all over from the sheep and the cattle there. Some of the other materials, there's a bone. This came from about 1 meter, or actually 0.6 of a meter beneath the surface. Here's glass. What we think might be a tooth or not, that's in the lab right now being identified. It could be an animal tooth, it could be a human tooth. That's a bone shard. You can't tell whether it's an animal bone or a human bone shard simply because it's such a small piece. There are techniques you can use to do that. Unfortunately, the test kits to be able to do that are very expensive, so we're still trying to raise the money to be able to do these things and differentiate the bone shards or not. This one obviously has the appearance of an animal bone, and it turns out to be an animal bone as well. And then construction materials, nails, pieces of glass, and then several interesting things. This is some kind of a plastic resin, and we found it 1.5 meters beneath the surface. And this is tar, and we found that below 1 meter, below the surface as well. As far as I know, and we work with Ilya a lot, there's not testimony that they were trying to melt the bodies apart, for example, because they had laid out all winter and they were all frozen together. Were they putting something combustible on them to be able to melt them, to be able to move them and put them into the mass grave? Were they trying to melt the ground first before they decided to use dynamite to blast the hole for the mass grave? Those are all questions that still need to be answered. So then what we do is we go back to our research questions that we initially posed, and this is 3 years now into the research, and then were we successful? And most of them are yes. We have been successful in finding areas of interest. Have we unequivocally found where the mass grave is? Not yet. We're still going to go back next summer, or this summer, to look at that circular anomaly, do more testing in that area. And then we have some other areas as well. Let me say something about DNA. If we do find human bones, one of the things that we'll be able to do, because I have a DNA laboratory at my university. When I was the dean, I was the director of the laboratory, but I still have a good relationship with them. If we do identify human bones, we can collect DNA and then do a DNA profile of those bones. And then we can do comparative studies between the bones that are collected. We can also go out to these various websites now where people send their DNA into and do comparisons there. Or we can do comparisons with relatives that have people that are interred here. So again, we don't have any human bone samples right now. So then these are the areas that we propose to work this coming summer, so in a few months, prioritized. So we estimate that this is probably about 5 days' work to be able to collect all the ground penetrating radar in these areas. One of the things we're probably going to see, probably here, is the remains of that barracks that was constructed in 1943. And then this seems to be, and then this was the center of the camp. And this seems to be then a likely area, because there's a testimony somewhere of the fact that the mass grave was created, and then they grew potatoes over top of or adjacent to where the mass grave was. So we'd think you would have a potato field a little bit away from the center of the camp, but adjacent to the camp. So this is the area that we're going to be looking in this summer. And then, our ultimate goal is to be able to find this place, to pass that information on to Karen, to Ilya, to whoever we have to pass it on to, and that it will be memorialized in the place where the mass grave is. So that's the future. Thank you.
There is so much hope in the air with this research and the profound discoveries that are being made. I don't know if people have questions for Phil at all. I mean, you did tell a story, and you had great visual symbols.
Right, I lost all semblance of time, too. I'm right on time, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a question. You talked about the original history evolving to the dynamite because the ground is so frozen.
Right.
Wouldn't there be certain characteristics in the geology as a result of a dynamite explosion that, As a result of the dynamite explosion, in terms of the heating of the soil and the shape, the contours of the ground, that might be telltale.
Right, yeah, exactly. And we've talked about that amongst ourselves, but we have not figured out kind of where to go and who to talk to. Within my university, I have approached everybody about, can we figure out the exact characteristics of this yellow resiny stuff? Can we verify that this is indeed tar and what the characteristics of it are? And everyone I've talked to said, we don't have the technology to do that, but somebody over at so-and-so does. But to be able to get somebody to actually do that and make those linkages, we haven't made yet. But we've talked about that because you're releasing an enormous amount of energy just in a millisecond when you do an explosion like that. And what's it going to do to the ground? And can that be another proxy, just like not finding the clay, just like the ground penetrating radar, just like the ERT, that will give more and more evidence? Because what we want is not one piece of evidence, but 3 or 4 different techniques, instrumentations, all corroborating with each other and saying, boy, this is the most likely spot. And then again, if we can pull up bone, have those identified, and then they're actually human bones, I think we're really on to something there.
Yes, I'm wondering how big could such a mass grave be for 800 people?
Yeah, how big would it be for 800 people? We have worked at many, many other places and found or still looking for mass graves. Škeda was mentioned in some conversation somewhere. That's on the other side of Latvia. That's where 2,800 women and children were buried in a trench that's about 100 meters long. To bury 800 people in a mass grave, I don't think, and Karen and Ilya might know better, that in the testimony, no one really says that the grave was such and such a size. Yeah, Ilya?
I can comment. I think there was a memoir by someone called Waltham, if I remember correctly, which said that actually there were 2 graves and each was 40 by 40 meters. 40 by 40 meters is a huge space. It's clearly an exaggeration. But concerning how big you need the pit to bury 800 people, the big problem here is that this was not a specially designed pit. So I'm sorry to going into detail, but for example, in Rumbula forest, where Riga Jews were killed, there the High Resistance Police Commander, Friedrich Jeckeln, specially employed an engineer to design the pits and to organize the killing in the most effective manner, which you called packing the sardines. So you can pack as many corpses as small space as possible. So here it seems that the people who were digging this grave, ordering the prisoners to dig the grave, had all kind of makeshift solutions. So it easily can be a relatively big but rather shallow pit. And also what we know from witness accounts, I do not remember now, who witnessed them, Fred some of may remember better. So they told that although they managed to pack corpses into the pit, but still, when they covered it with soil, there was sort of a mound. And only as the corpses were decomposing, the soil depressed, till it was lower than the ground level. And then the commandant of the camp, Zach, ordered soil to be poured there in a kind of additional layer to flatten the ground and to plant potatoes there. And he said the Jews make good fertilizer. He was an agronomist by trade. So that's the problem, that we do not know actually if we're looking for a, let's say, trench, as most of the shooting pits would be, or we're actually looking for something that is more of a bigger but shallower bowl or whatever. Yeah. So if it is dug, it would be more probably be something of a rectangle. Yeah. But exactly, if we're speaking that most of the pit was created by dynamiting, then it can be of round or uneven shape, that's the biggest problem, that we actually do not know how should look the thing that we're looking for. And that's why initially, when we saw in the very first research, the rectangle in the ground, we were so enthusiastic because the pits, the shooting pits, usually look like rectangles, plus minus. But now we understand, unfortunately, research gave us more questions than answers.
Right, and that's the nature of science.
I apologize, but that's how science works.
Yeah. And then we worked in Ponere, which is in Vilnius, and 78,000 Jews were murdered there, plus there's 100,000 bodies in the forest there. And they used old pits that were dug as a fuel depot. And we found one that had not been memorialized yet. It was 25 meters by 25 meters. It was fairly circular. And then there are people that can make these estimates and formulas you can plug it into, and they thought between 6,000 and 8,000 people buried in a 25 by 25 meter, 6 meter deep pit. So 800, if something is 10 meters across, then you could certainly fit, depending on how deep it is, 800 bodies, something like that.
I think. So you mentioned that some portion of what had been the camp has been developed for housing. I wonder, did those who were involved in the construction, were they ever asked if they found anything that might give some indication?
Yeah, it's, I think housing is an overstatement. These are makeshift summer kind of residences. They're shacks, essentially, some nicer than others.
Most of these are garden allotments, so we're speaking of very small temporary cuts, and then kind of warm houses or whatever you call them for growing, I don't know, cucumbers.
Yeah, and given the fact that was stated before about the sheep and the cows, and then if you're digging your garden plot and you come across some bones, you think that they're a sheep and a cow and have no thought that it might be human remains as well. Yeah.
Thank you for this fascinating presentation. I have a serious question. I have a serious question, which might sound unpleasant, which is that you've been working there for how many years now? 3?
3.
3 years with the most sophisticated instruments possible at this time, and you haven't found anything. You haven't found any human trace. What is the chance that you won't find anything, and that there's something wrong here? Because I'm so impressed with the tools that you used, but you have come up with nothing human, and there's a lot of people that were buried, we think.
Yeah, I mean, from the records and from the testimony, I am, and I always refer to Ilya or Karen, we're 100% sure there is a mass grave somewhere there. Now, where it is we're using sort of the best approximation based on the information that we have as to where we should be looking first. And the best information that we had originally was to look kind of near the central part of the camp. And we've covered a lot of those areas now. So we're starting to move out to the periphery a little bit. Will we find it? Won't we find it? We don't know. We've covered maybe of the area that is now the park, we've covered maybe 15%, something like that. So all we can do is keep returning and
Something about the testimony. What were people able to give testimony about with regard to the mass grave?
yeah, I'll refer to Karen or Ilya on that.
This is incredibly interesting, and all of the possibilities. I think what's interesting is how Ilya described the grave, and I would describe it differently from the testimony that I've encountered. So there's so many little bits and pieces of testimony. So the sardine-style shooting happened at Bercheniki, and in a more formal presentation of shooting, this, at least 800 people actually either died or were killed in the first 3 months when the ground was frozen. They were stacked up next, according to the testimonies that I've read, they were stacked up next to a barn. So then the question is, well, where was that barn? And then if you ask Fred Zilberger, who was actually there and dug some of the graves, he said the bodies were stacked and they were frozen and they were stuck together and they had to use a pickaxe to pull them apart. So that's not sardine burial, that's a different kind of pieces of human flesh. I mean, it's terrible to go into that kind of detail, but it's in contrast to what we've accomplished here, is to create dignity for that kind of history. But I think all we have are bits and pieces. And so we are still looking for science to rescue us. There's not a real definition of the boundaries of the camp. There were no fences. So we don't know what the size, we know it's about 500 acres, but we don't really know where the borders are. We know where the river is. So there are some things that are sort of defined, but Fred said, well, the landscape doesn't look, it looks different because it's all been regraded. So what got lost in that process? And where are the woods? Have the woods moved? So they were buried in the woods. Well, what does that mean? So there's a lot of questions. Are we looking in the right place? Will it take 10 years?
Thank you. So the grave should be there because that's what all witness accounts state, so we're sure that it's there. The big problem is that from 1947, this territory was part of the Soviet military air base. Yeah, so it was not the airfield itself, which was nearby, but it was restricted military area. So there is no documentation on construction works there. So far, the documentation we have located is that the city transfers the land with the buildings, and the buildings are listed, and so we actually know how many masonry and how many wooden structures there were to the military. And the maps that we have from 1970s and so on, we can presume that these are altered to hide some military facilities. Because, for example, they do not show the runway of this military airfield, it doesn't show the hangars, which are still there, and it's actually, I don't know, if any of you is interested in Cold War history, you can visit like a real air base where the Soviet fighter jets were stationed. There is minimal possibility that the Soviets have found the grave and have disposed of the corpses. But then there still will be disturbance in the soil. So even if we do not find there the human remains, at least the scientific research would show massive disturbance in the soil that again is not natural. Yeah, so if you even exhume these corpses or whatever, you will see very strong traces of this work. So if the grave is in the area, or was in the area that we'll be able to cover, then we'll find it. The problem is, yes, we may have to work for 10 years, or we can add, instead of the team of approximately 9-10 people, if we had 200 people with the amount of equipment, then we would do it much faster. But unfortunately, that's the limitations, and we want to have there some sort of memorial sign. That's why we, at some point, may stop, probably. But we hope not to stop.
How about 2 more questions? We have 23 singers here that want to help us to come to a close. And we also have food. So, no more questions? Okay. No more questions. Thank you, Phil. And Phil, you have a report. Can I put that on the website? Okay, so you can read the details. How many pages? 65 pages of his report at Jungfernhof. So that will help us.